So, a few weeks back, I made a statement on Twitter that political correctness ended the day online privacy ended. Now, it's a big statement to make, especially considering the fact that political correctness does not appear to have anything to do with online privacy as such. So, let me explain this statement by taking the two concepts separately before bringing them together. Let's talk about online privacy first. Now I'm going to refer to two academic articles, one by Professor Neil Richards, who is a professor at Washington University Law School, and the other is the article by Danah Boyd, who is a doctoral candidate at University of California, Berkeley, and is also a fellow at Harvard University. So, what does Professor Neil Richards write about privacy? Well, he says that privacy is not about having secrets, but privacy is more about having a space, a free space where you can think freely. Now, what does this mean in actual reality? Say you are in a room, and this is example used in one of these articles. I think it's Danah Boyd. Now, say you are in a room and you are talking to one of your friends. Now you know that you've got the privacy of that room. There are walls around it, and there's only so much the volume of your voices can travel outside that room. So you are confident that nobody is overhearing that conversation. In online environment, say you are discussing something with your friends through messages which no one can read or emails which no one is supposed to read, but then you have constant surveillance which makes those emails and messages accessible to third parties. You lose that security of thoughts. Professor Richards says that it is really important for the democratic process to function effectively, the democratic rights to function effectively, to have that privacy, that feeling of security that your thoughts are secure. The moment you start thinking about your thoughts being read by someone else, about the thought that you are being surveyed, you start acting differently. Imagine yourself in a public situation. There's a different way you'll sit in your own house on your couch watching television, and there's a different way you'll be sitting at a bus stop or in a pub, because everybody's watching and you behave accordingly. So there could be instances where you are discussing something which is critical of, say, some political policy of the government or something on those lines, and then suddenly you start thinking that, oh, maybe the government is reading what I'm saying or what I'm talking. Then you would automatically try not to dig yourself into a hole, and that would mean is that your political voice will get stifled. So professor says that the first amendments, because he's Washington based and of course he's talking about the American society and the surveillance in American society. So he says that First Amendment provides a right to free speech. That right is jeopardized. Now you have got a First Amendment right that allows you to discuss freely, but then you have constant surveillance which makes you change the way you behave, what you talk. Are those amendments of any use to you? It further goes on to talk about how people have brought cases in courts that their First Amendment rights are under threat, And not just First Amendment rights, but they have even included the Fourth Amendment rights, which give you security in your house and property. And the courts have said that, okay, even if surveillance is bad, what is the harm that you have suffered? The courts fail to realize what the harm is. Now, I'm going to come to the harm a bit later in this video. But the thing is that democratic rights are so important that if there's something wrong that needs to be fixed about your society, you need to have a free discussion. To have that free discussion, you need to first develop the ideas. And to develop those ideas, you need a free space. And of course, free space includes not just yourself, but your friends. Danah Boyd, in her article, which is about Facebook's privacy train wreck. Now, I might say over here that Facebook is becoming more of the fall guy because everybody is doing similar things. Everybody is doing dodgy things because that's the way surveillance machinery is working. It's just that the Facebook is taking the fall for everyone so that everybody else could escape. So I don't trust anyone, basically. That's what I want to say for the moment. But the thing is that Danah Boyd writes that this sometimes privacy is not about just not being watched by anyone at all, but it could also be about obscurity. Now, what is obscurity? Let's say that you are in an open space, in a crowded open space, and you're talking to your friend. Danah Boyd says that you would still be able to freely discuss a lot of things with your friends simply because everybody else is doing their own thing and there's a lot of noise and there's only so much your voice can travel. So even when there are so many people around, you still feel secure in what you are talking to your friend because nobody else would be interested in knowing that. And if anybody else is interested and comes close, you can always see that someone is coming close and you might change the topic, which you always do. So it's not about that you don't discuss things in public which do not have an element of privacy to them, but that element is based on obscurity that nobody else cares or knows, and you still feel secure about it. Surveillance destroys those things. That comfort zone is destroyed by surveillance because you no longer have that comfort zone. Now, Danah Boyd was writing about how Facebook it altered the news feed, and then because of the criticisms, they added the privacy options. But the thing is that she said that there are things that you don't want everyone in your circle to know. She said that when you are in a pub, you deal with people differently, and then when you are in a public park. So it depends, your interaction with others depends upon the context you are interacting in. You will interact differently with people who work with you or who go to school with you. Then you will interact with your, say, siblings or family members. So the point that Danah Boyd makes is that privacy does not necessarily have to be secret. So the thing is that privacy is more about being comfortable with what you believe in and being comfortable with whom you are sharing that with. Say you tell your friend a secret, you expect that that secret won't be divulged because it might be uncomfortable. So that's what privacy is about. Privacy is about that you're discussing things and you want to discuss them freely. Now, what happens when you have constant surveillance? As I've already mentioned, that your free flow of thoughts is affected by that because you change your behavior, because you don't want to be pointed out in the crowd. You want to be just mixed with the crowd and not to stand out lest someone starts harassing you or something. So the first thing is that your First Amendment rights are only reduced to rights on paper. You have the right to free speech, but you are not exercising it. So quotes Professor Richards says that courts have, gives quite a few examples. His article's titled The Dangers of Surveillance. And he gives quite a few examples from the US Supreme Court as well, where the court says that we don't know what harm you're talking of. What harm have you suffered? Today I'm going to give you 3 harms, basically 2 harms. The third is connected with the second harm, but I'm going to give you the harm which you actually suffer. The first harm that you suffer is the psychological harm. How does that happen? If someone feels that they are being constantly surveyed, it affects their behavior, which ultimately affects their relationships. The damage is done. They suffer psychologically. That's the first harm, and depending upon how severely a person feels affected, their suffering would be accordingly. So it's not that surveillance causes no harm. Surveillance causes psychological harm. It affects your relationships. It affects the way you behave. It alters your behavior pattern. In fact, a reason to have massive surveillance is just to make people behave in a particular way. What is that particular way? In a way where that people will not question political decisions, which goes against the very breadth and scope of the First Amendment rights. And not just the First Amendment rights, even if those rights were non-existent. Why they exist, I'll come to that in a moment. But even if those rights were non-existent, even if it was just a democracy, the basic concept of democracy is based on the fact that if you don't like a political decision, you discuss it with your friends and people around you, and then you come up with solutions. If that is affected, then you don't have democracy at all. First Amendment rights were put in place exactly for that reason. And one of the overriding concerns of people was that some people might have political views which are not consistent with others. But they said it is important to have those political views. We may not support those political views, but we would want to support that person's right to have those political views, because it is lesser of the two evils. If you are living in a society where you cannot have political views, that's when your democracy starts suffering. That's when you start suffering in the society, because you cannot have a political voice. So it's more important to have political views than everybody agreeing to those political views. I'll come to the example of homosexuality in a moment when I'll talk about political correctness. Of course, I will talk about the controversial aspect as well as I'll talk about the solution as well. However, the thing is that if you don't feel like putting yourself out, putting your views out, you would not know what others think on the same matter. You would not be able to present arguments that would change the views of others or get replies from others that might change your views. Better society will not evolve because the democratic voice have been stifled. So psychological harm is on one side. The injury to democratic rights is the second harm, which is this what Professor Richards is worried about. First, if First Amendment rights were not there, people would have sought those rights. But having those First Amendment rights give authorities the opportunity to say that you already have those rights. We cannot take away those rights, when the fact is that those rights are actively being taken away. Now let me criticize FBI over here. In the 1940s, during the Second World War, Charlie Chaplin, who doesn't know Charlie Chaplin? Charlie Chaplin had a bit of a liking for socialism. So FBI abused the machinery to discredit that man, and they made that man's career suffer. Perhaps you should Google it, go to Wiki and go through links and read about it. But the fact is that the state machinery was abused. And the state machinery was abused to undo what First Amendment rights were providing that man. Second, and this case is referred to by Professor Richards as well, that is the case of Martin Luther King. FBI in this case went overboard to get evidence so that they might be able to either discredit that man or they might be able to blackmail that man. I mean, is this the kind of things you expect from your premier agency? Is this really protecting your democratic rights, or is it making sure that your democratic rights are destroyed? Take the example of Black Panthers Party. A political movement started to give blacks better say to improve their condition in the society, and FBI tried every means to destroy that movement. And these are not the things that I'm saying. If you research on your own, you'll find all the details about these incidents. So on one hand, you have First Amendment rights, which give you the right to have free democratic speech so that you can have your own democratic views. And on the other, state machinery is being used to destroy those democratic rights. Do you really have First Amendment rights? Surveillance is a way of curbing your freedom, your democratic freedom. So if courts don't know what harm surveillance does, I would like to tell them that firstly, it causes psychological harm, as I've already explained, and secondly, it causes irreparable injury to democratic rights. There's law of nuisance, in which case, if you own a property or you're renting a property and there's something happening around that property which is affecting your enjoyment of that property, that is considered nuisance, and the court intervenes to give you relief in that case. Damage to political injury to political rights, even if it hasn't suffered, even if someone has only felt uncomfortable, it is still like that nuisance. So even where a person may not have suffered psychological harm, even when the person's democratic rights might not have been actually injured, but it is still a case of nuisance. Although the only thing is that democratic rights are not the same as property rights. Property rights are a bit different. However, what's more important, democratic rights or property rights? You may not have property rights. You might be a homeless man living on the streets, but you still want your democratic rights. Your democratic rights are more important than your property rights. So there are three harms which I suggest that the court should look at into, which is the harm of the surveillance. Now let's come to the second aspect, that is of political correctness. In political correctness, we don't try to offend others. Now it's a good concept. It makes society really feel good. And it makes easier to live in a society where nobody is humiliating others. But the only problem is it doesn't really work like that. Now, let's take the example of homosexuality now. There are people who support equal rights for homosexual community, and there are people who oppose that. But the thing is, every time someone opposes or says something in opposition, people try to shut him out. The political correctness says that you cannot express views against homosexuality. If you say anything against homosexuality, you're a homophobe. Now, with all due respect, this is what the First Amendment rights were about. That you may not support the other person's views, but that person has every right to have those views. Political correctness takes away his democratic rights to express his views. I agree, homosexual community has every right to seek equal rights. But if you want to criticize people for discriminating against homosexual community, you should also criticize people who try to shut out people who are giving a different opinion. As much a right the homosexual community has to express themselves, the other side has the equal right to express themselves. Take the case of feminism. Whenever someone says something which goes against what feminists want, they try to shut him out as well. These all these things go against the very concept of democracy. The concept of democracy is that you may not right the other person's views, but the other person has equal democratic rights to express themselves. Now, this brings me to to those scenarios where people say something on social media and then they suffer consequently on their job or in an interview because they said something. Every time someone is fired for saying something on social media or denied an opportunity because of what they say, that person should sue the person for discriminating for the democratic rights, for the democratic opinions. You have a democratic right to have your own opinions about issues. And if you are being made a scapegoat for having your opinions and expressing them, then you are being denied your freedom of free speech. And whoever is denying that is going against the better interests of the society, is going against the democracy. Nobody has got the right to pick you out for your opinions. You have a right to have an opinion as well as a right to express that opinion. Now, this is why privacy and political correctness intermingle at this level in a way where one is affecting the other. When you don't have privacy anymore, your views are public. And when your views are public, you can be made to suffer for your views, which goes against the very premise of democracy. So, what do we do in such a situation? Do we give up our right to have our opinions? Would that be a good outcome for democracy? Or do we want to take a stand over here and say, no, we want to have our freedom. This is our sacred right to have our democratic opinions. And if the only way to have that right is to express ourselves freely, then to hell with political correctness. Political correctness should not be a means of destroying your democratic voice. Now, let me come to the homosexuality example and explain what the solution to the problem is. I do not think it's a good idea to have two different concepts living in the society at the same time, which is why this solution that I presented in my video, My Democracy of Future, becomes all the more important. Homosexual community is a minority community and I respect their land rights. I want them to have their own petty fortress from Walzer, as I explained in that video. If you haven't watched that video, I suggest you do to understand what I'm saying. So I want to give homosexual community their petty fortress so they can flourish. They can have their own rules, own marriage laws, own children rights and everything. And I want the heterosexual community to have their own petty fortresses so that there is no clash. Of course, in that case, in that world that I envision in that video, you do freely move around, but there can always be some sort of restriction. Like say if straight people go as tourists to or to work in homosexual communities, amongst homosexual community, then there should be a restriction of public display of affection by them. And if the homosexual community people go to the heterosexual community's society, then there should be a similar restriction of public display of affection on them. So those things can be worked out, or there might be some other better solution. That's for the academics to work out. But the thing is that I do want to give homosexual community their rights because they have equal right to this earth than anyone else. So the best solution is to give them their rights and the other community their own right, rather than making both communities suffer or letting the democracy suffer. So anyway, the thing is, if we end this political correctness, it is not going to make things easy. It will make things tougher. There are people who have very strong racial opinions. Of course, when political correctness will end, you will get a lot more racial rhetoric or even religious rhetoric. But then again, the thing is, when opinions will be voiced out in open, there would be counter arguments as well. So depending upon who has got better arguments, either one of the sides will change their opinion or we'll have petty fortresses, but there would still be democracy in the sense that your voice will not be stifled. So it's more important to have a free democratic society than a politically correct society. If you cannot express yourself freely, then you don't have democracy and your society will only deteriorate from there. Privacy is essential for that, so that you have a free space to think freely without any influence from any other influence from any other angle, which should alter the way you should be thinking. So which is why I say the day and age of political correctness ended the day online privacy ended. That you cannot have political correctness when you don't have online privacy, because you lose your democracy. Anyway, I might have missed a few things which I might have loved to add to this video, but this video is getting too long, so I'll finish it over here. Thanks for watching.